นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ And blessings to you all. The Buddha spent 45 years of his life teaching the Dhamma, the way or the path that leads out of suffering, and what we call the Eightfold Noble Path. And the teachings of the Buddha all are related to that. As we know, the central teachings of the Buddha were the Four Noble Truths: suffering, its cause, the cessation of suffering, and the path, the Eightfold Path that leads out of suffering. And these are the framework he used to expand on and explain the Dhamma for the benefit of all of us, those living in the time of the Buddha, and for us. We can still benefit from these teachings. And you'll notice if you ever read suttas that there's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of use of the same terminology to explain human experience. There may be slight variations, but many terms and explanations are repeated over and over again in the different teachings the Buddha gave. So he would use terms and terminology to help explain our problem as human beings. And our biggest problem is that we are subject to stress, suffering, and even what we call rebirth. That was considered a problem in the bigger picture, what we call samsara. And the Buddha was teaching a way out of samsara, the endless round of rebirth. He's teaching a way out of the endless experience of birth, aging, sickness and death. And we're in the middle of our life now, and we're experiencing one lifetime of aging, sickness and death and associated problems of pain, mental pain, physical pain. And the Buddha was teaching us a way out of the endless cycle of that, samsara. So he used ways of explaining our experience and pointing out how suffering arises. And he would encourage people to look at their own experience as a human being, analyze it sometime, examine it more closely, not to take things at face value, not to take things for granted, not to be complacent, not to give up. Because often our tendency as we live our life is just to sort of give up on life. We achieve a certain amount as we grow up, and then we sort of become complacent and say, well, this is my lot, however good or bad it may be. It seems to be one of the problems we encounter, particularly through habit. As human beings, we follow our habits, don't we? And we build up a whole habit system, good and bad, physical behavior, speech habits, and particularly mental habits, the way we think, our attitudes, our views and beliefs can become very habitual. And that can be a cause for much suffering, especially if we have a wrong understanding of experience. We often repeatedly do things, say things, think things that bring us more and more stress and suffering. So the Buddha encouraged us to examine our existence as a human being, to see what's there, get to know ourselves better, so that we can understand why we get stressed, why we have suffering, why even rebirth occurs at death, and why it occurred before, led us to this life, why it occurs again. And one of the basic frameworks that he used for understanding our experience is what we call the 5 Khandas, or the 5 groups of experience that make up a human being. The word Khanda means group, or sometimes they translate it as a heap, like a pile. Just like here in Australia we have a lot of gravel roads, and so they have piles of gravel everywhere, and the formal word they use for gravel is aggregate. So every time we drive down the road here from the monastery, there's piles of gravel, and they have a sign there saying, road aggregate, or aggregate do not steal, because I think people sometimes steal it. So we always laugh, because it's like a pile of aggregates just sitting there. Because this thing we call a body is like a heap, or several heaps all together. So these 5 aggregates, or 5 heaps of experience, is the Buddha's shorthand for describing our experience as human being, to help us in our examination of the truth and understanding the truth. So the first is what we call the Rupa Khanda, physical form, the body, physicality, materiality. The second is feeling, a pile or a heap of feeling. When you think about it, we have a lot of feeling in our day, our life. He divided it up into pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and feeling that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant nor painful. What you might call neutral feeling. That's the second Khanda, and that's both mental feeling and feeling associated with the body. And that's one heap, one pile in our experience as a human being. Then there's sanya, perception, the way we perceive things, the way we remember things, the labels we put on our experience. So that's sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, concepts, ideas. We have our way of remembering things. That's another pile of experience, another heap. Then there's the mental formation, sankhara khanda. Literally the thoughts that we have, particularly intentional or volitional thought. So it's where we make karma, that part of our mind that is making karma, good and bad, acting out things either on the level of thoughts or through speech or through action. And the last khanda is vijnana khanda, sense consciousness. So seeing, the mind that arises at the eye, seeing. When there's a healthy eye, there's light, you can have seeing consciousness arise. Or hearing. Hearing consciousness can arise if the audio is working. I hope it is for you at home, then you can have hearing consciousness. If the microphone breaks or the technology is not working, you might not hear me. You might see me but not hear me. So if the room is silent, hearing consciousness is not happening. And then we have touching, tasting, smelling, and then the mind itself is another doorway that gives rise to consciousness. So that's another heap, another pile, a pile of consciousness. So the Buddha called these the 5 piles or groups to help us to look at our human body and mind and understand it better. So there's the physical group, based around the physical body, and then there's the other 4 piles are the mental group. And particularly the Buddha was interested in finding out about a human being and how suffering arises, what we can do about it, how we can end it, and using these 5 khandas as an area to study. So we hear Dhamma and we learn Dhamma from the books and from talks, and that you might call the external study, the external pariyatti, the external study of things, listening, reading. But then we have the internal study from our own experience of this mind. And these 5 khandhas are what we are studying on the inside. We begin by learning, by hearing, getting the words, the concepts, the ideas, at least to some extent. We have a basic understanding by listening to the Dhamma, but then we have to put it into practice and start learning from our experience. And so the Buddha gave us these 5 areas to look at in our experience, and gave us the tools to do that. So that's the Eightfold Path. That's where it fits into our practice. We're developing the Eightfold Path to develop the ability to see and know our experience as it is. And we can develop steadiness of mind, stillness of mind, calm, states of calm, and the ability to pay attention to things, mindfulness, clear comprehension, so that our wisdom faculty, the mind that knows and sees, can grow by watching and developing what you might call a more detached awareness to our own experience as a human being, and getting to know these khandhas as they are, these groups or piles of experience as they are, rather than what we tend to do is just look at this body and mind through a distorted lens or a distorted view of it. So we tend to follow the biases of our mind, our prejudices, our attachments, our beliefs. And we have all kinds of assumptions around this body and mind, or what you call the 5 khandhas. But the Buddha, having gone through that himself and realized the danger of that, the harm of that, he encouraged his students to look more deeply and go beyond some of those delusions and biases of mind by investigating very closely the nature of these khandhas. So these 5 khandhas are very central to the Buddhist teaching and to our practice. Obviously, people who don't know Buddhism, don't study Buddhism, might not know these terms or think about their own body and mind or their life in this way. But as soon as you come in contact with the Buddhist teachings, you realize how central they are. And it kind of gives you a language and a framework for looking at your own experience every day. You have the Rupa Khandha, Vedana Khandha, Sanya Khandha, Sankhara Khandha, Vijnana Khandha. And it's very interesting. Many people find it very interesting and are quite curious to learn from their own experience using this framework. And because you're really getting to understand what is a human being, a human life, a human being, both physically and mentally. What the Buddha pointed out and quickly gave us insight into, or his insight passing on to us for us to check and examine for ourselves, is that these khandhas are the basis for the arising of delusion, misunderstanding of truth, wrong beliefs, and what we call clinging or attachment, upadana. So he sometimes called them the upadana khandhas, the basis for wrong view, the basis for the attachment to a sense of self. And he identified this is the cause of our suffering as human beings. We attach to this body and mind with a sense of self or ownership. Now he understood that, but we don't understand that yet. So he was encouraging us to look and learn from our experience and see, is that true? To question our experience, examine it more closely, using the tools of the Eightfold Noble Path and all the other teachings he gave as aids to help us do that correctly and well. And this is particularly what we're doing in meditation, is learning to develop more awareness so we can look back at these 5 khandhas and ask questions about them and see how they really are. Do they really belong to a self? Are they really a self? Are they really me, mine, myself? These are the kind of questions the Buddha encouraged us to bring up in our life. not just simply in sitting on a meditation cushion like we are now, but at any time in your day you can have a look at your khandhas and see what's going on. Look at them and examine them more carefully, bringing up more awareness directed back to your khandhas. Whether you're working, relaxing, socializing, on your own with others, busy, not busy, khandhas are always there. These 5 heaps of existence are always sitting there waiting for us to learn from them. And we should, because they're the basis of clinging and attachment. And the Buddha pointed out, anything we cling to in this world brings us suffering. So ultimately, our experience of the world is based on these 5 khandhas, coming out from these 5 khandhas. And because they're still basis for suffering, as long as we haven't realized that, we'll keep suffering. And nobody wants suffering, pain. Nobody wants unhappiness, stress. So the attachment to these khandhas is the basis for stress and suffering. So it's a good thing to learn about and find out about. They should really teach this in schools and anywhere else in the world, because it's such a useful bit of knowledge to have. It takes time and effort, but it's so liberating for us to understand more and see the true nature of these 5 khandhas. Ajahn Chah used to say the 5 khandhas are like a red-hot ball of iron. They're the basis of our suffering, just in the way you pick up something that's red-hot, it's going to hurt you, burn you. He said, wherever you attach to the 5 khandhas, you're going to suffer. Wherever you identify with them as self, wherever your mind takes ownership of them, you'll suffer. The goal of the practice is nibbana, and that's not the 5 khandhas. So that's something that already helps us. We're not practicing to make these 5 khandhas the best khandhas we can have, because ultimately they're unsatisfactory, they're a source of suffering. But it would seem most people in the world are working on that principle, that they want to make their body the best body they can have, the most beautiful, strongest, best kind of proportions. And their mind, they're trying to always have the most pleasant feelings, nice thoughts, interesting thoughts, the most access to the best kind of consciousness, sense objects and sense consciousness that we can have. So the best of the best of the best is what we're generally looking for in life, to bring us more sense of happiness and satisfaction. But the Buddha saved us some time. He pointed out, he said, no, this isn't going to work. You'll never find true happiness, true satisfaction by grasping at your khandhas as self. They're a basis for clinging, and that clinging brings with it suffering. Why? Because ultimately this body and mind, these 5 khandhas, they're subject to change. They don't last. And ultimately we can't control them because they don't belong to us, they're not self. And as the mind starts to realize that, it experiences more peace and letting go. But this is a process that takes time, coming through examination and learning from our experience. We have to gradually wake up to the truth. So it's something we have to keep looking back at. When I attach to this body and mind with delusion, I'm going to suffer. The central teaching in Buddhism, what we call paticca samuppada, is teaching on the dependent origination or dependent co-arising of phenomena, and particularly how suffering arises for humans. So this is central to our understanding of these 5 khandhas as well. The Buddha pointed out, once you've been born, you've got a body, or even at the start of birth maybe, how does birth occur? Does that just come out of nowhere? Does it come out of, is it random? Does it just come out of the blue? Suddenly a baby is born from the sperm of a father, the ovary of the mother, the egg of the mother meeting, and then you get conception. Is that where it all starts? Well, the Buddha's explanation is, well, consciousness enters the fetus at that moment of conception. You have consciousness arising with the baby, the new baby that's forming in the mother's womb. But that consciousness already has karma from last life. It's not just instantly manifested out of nowhere. It's coming from karma from last life, attachment to last life, conditioning the consciousness, bringing it birth in this life. So already that's teaching us something. And what is born? Well, what is born is the human being, and that's, another set of 5 khandhas has arisen. So our khandhas are actually the result of past karma, majority of them. In that sense, they're the resultant karma, which is kind of passive. Your body, physical body that arises is the result of past karma. You can't get your body to happen that quickly, so it has to be past karma that's given rise to it. Of course, once we're born, how we teach and lead our life and how we teach ourselves will affect how we relate to this body, and we can make fresh karma as we go through our life, and so it will affect the body. But our body, our feelings and perceptions are the result of past karma coming up. But where we make fresh karma, fresh action, fresh choices, is through the sankhara khandha, mental formations. And that's where the practice of the Dhamma comes in. Every day, every moment of every day, we have choices that we can make. We can take different directions in our life. We can make good karma by developing skillful mental formations, developing the path, say. Or we can make bad karma that increases our delusion, increases our attachment, increases our suffering. That's the sankhara khandha of this set of 5 khandhas that we've inherited. The sankhara khandha is the active one. It's where we make new karma all the time through thinking and then acting it out, speaking it, acting it out. So the active khandha, the sankhara khandha, that's where we are applying the practice. And the Paticca teaching is another explanation that helps us to analyze and understand our experience better. So the Buddha said that every moment we're having sense contact arise. So we have this body, we have sights coming up into our consciousness periodically, we have sound, taste, smell, touch. Depending on what consciousness arises, they're alternating all the time. We have sense contact taking place. With sense contact, we'll have feeling arise, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. We also have perception arise with our sense contact, how we remember things, how we label things. And that's very important because that also will affect the kind of feeling that comes up with that experience of each sense contact. So just for example, say we're meditating and we've been meditating for a long time. Just now we meditated for 10 minutes, not very long. But say you're on a meditation retreat or you're just meditating for a long time. You're calm, you're quiet, your eyes are closed, and then you hear the sound of the bell. Well, you would probably know instantly, oh, that's the sound of a bell. You got the basic sense contact arising, sound of a bell arising. But straight away perception arises, so you say bell, and they will also have meaning at the end of the meditation session. That's perception. But the perception may affect how you treat the sound, how your mind looks at that sound as it arises. So if you've been sitting for a long time, you've had a lot of pain and you're tired and you're squirming and you just want to end, well, when you hear the bell, there might be a sense of relief. So perception comes up, we can finish now, I can get up. So you might actually be quite happy to hear that sound. But if you've been very peaceful and calm and enjoying your meditation, you don't want to stop, so you hear the bell, you might feel disappointed. Or if you are somebody who likes to sort of acquire knowledge, you might hear the sound of the bell and you think, what is that bell? Where did it come from? Is that a Tibetan sounding bell, or is it Thai bell, or is it an Australian bell? You might go into just thinking about what kind of bell it is. That may bring you some pleasure, just the curiosity, but it may be a different reaction based on the kind of perception that comes with the sound of the bell. So every moment of sense contact brings with it feeling and perception, which are two of the khandas, and then the mental formations arise, which are the active part of these five khandas, and that's where suffering or mindfulness and wisdom can arise. That's where our karma starts to be active and determines what happens next. So in the teaching of the Paticca-samuppada, the Buddha said, well, you have perception and feeling arise with that sense contact, whether it's seeing, hearing, tasting, touching. One or two things can happen. You can either give in to the particular desire that may be stimulated by the arising of that sense contact with the feeling, the perception. So it may be one of delighting in, interest, liking, and that's one kind of craving, tanha, or it can give rise to mindfulness. You hear the sound, and because you're training in mindfulness and developing insight into your experience, it may just give rise to mindfulness to know sound, and you know the perception and you know the feeling. It may be pleasant or unpleasant, but the presence of mindfulness and wisdom at that moment cuts off craving, stops craving from arising. You've got those two options, you could say, at that moment of hearing the sound of the bell, whether it's pleasant to you or unpleasant, depending on your perception, what feeling is generated. You have the chance to develop the path towards the end of suffering, or you have craving arise, which we know is the cause of suffering. Different forms of desire, wanting to have, wanting to be, wanting to become. So with the case of that bell, it might be, I like the bell, maybe I could go and buy one of those and get one, and off you start thinking about that. What shop, or get it online, and which place sells it for the cheapest, and blah, blah, blah. A certain form of craving forms around the delight in, or you might hate the bell and say, I never want to hear that bell again. I'm never going to come to this meditation retreat again. I don't want to hear these bells again. They just become a sign of torture and all that pain I was suffering, perhaps. Either way, that's craving at work, isn't it? Craving arises. But for one who is training in mindfulness, if they're trained enough, they hear the bell, they know the sound, they know the feeling, they know the perception, and that's where it ends. And the mind stays calm, clear, aware. And they know that sound is impermanent. It arises, consciousness arises, and then it ceases. Whether you're mindful or not, that's taking place, isn't it? You hear the sound of a bell, it just arises and ceases. It's not there all the time, is it? It's just a few moments of sound and then gone. But if there's not much mindfulness or understanding, well, craving will be stimulated in one way or another, even just briefly for a moment, or sometimes very intensely, just depending on the experience of the senses. Or the Dhamma is there because you're practicing mindfulness, developing insight, contemplating your experience, and you say, impermanent, arises, ceases, and you don't create any craving or mental proliferation around that. What happens there is, the action of the Sankhara Khanda. It's the Sankhara Khanda, the mental formations in practice at that moment. Hearing the bell, what happens next? That's the Sankhara Khanda. The consciousness of hearing, that's the Vijnana Khanda. There's the feeling, the perception, and the Rupa, well, that's having an ear that can provide a pathway for sound to come in and sense consciousness to arise. If your ears weren't working, unfortunately, if you were deaf, say, or you had an ear impediment, or you put mufflers on, there wouldn't be any sound, so ear consciousness wouldn't arise. So, but all the five khandas are present in that one moment of hearing the sound of the bell. But what happens next is your Sankhara Khanda. So what do we what are we doing in Dhamma practice, and particularly in relation to these 5 khandhas, is well, we're training the Sankhara khandha to know the other khandhas and to know them clearly as they are. And to cut a long story short, to bring the mind to see with awareness that these khandhas are all impermanent in their nature. They're anicca. As we chant every morning, Rupang anicca, Vedana anicca, Sanya anicca. Why do we chant that? It's because it's true. And that's just reminding us of the theory behind what we're doing, but then there's the actual practice of mindfulness, observing these khandhas arising and ceasing from moment to moment through our day, the changes of the body, the changes of feeling, pleasant and unpleasant, and also observing how suffering arises when we give in to craving. Craving hardens and becomes attachment, identification, clinging, which leads on to suffering. Because if you cling on to that which is impermanent, as it changes, you get a shock, you get disappointed, so you realize you can't own these khandhas. The more you see that they're impermanent, the more you relinquish that sense of ownership, because you realize you don't actually own them. They are conditions that have their own causes, arise and pass away because of those causes and different factors, different conditions. So in the case of hearing the bell, we might have that sense of self arise. I am hearing the bell, I like the bell, I don't like the bell. But if you're watching more closely and you keep examining this truth through your practice, what you come to see is actually there's no person there. There's the sound of the bell, which has been hit by someone else, comes across the airwaves to your ears, the ears hear, then there's with the consciousness arising, and then there's feeling, there's perception, but there's no actual person involved in that. You may form a sense of self, but that's actually just a superficial reality. And it's useful to say, I'm hearing the sound, and we talk about what kind of sound it is. We can do that. But the danger is we start to cling to this sense of self as something more substantial, and we kind of stamp the sense of self on our experience. Even something as simple as hearing a bell becomes, I am hearing a bell, I like the sound, I don't like the sound, I want the sound, I want to keep it, I want to hear it all the time, or I hate the sound, I don't want it. The sense of self covers over these khandhas all the time with this superficial sense of ownership. As we're investigating through meditation, developing mindfulness, observing more closely our experience, you're starting to take out that sense of self. So there is consciousness arising and then ceasing. There's feeling, there's perception, but the mind that is trained in the path is coming to more and more see that these things are not a self. They're just a changing process of arising and passing away, a process of causes and conditions coming up, arising, passing away, and it's not actually a self. It's not a person, a being. It's not that there's nothing there, but starting to see the process of dependent arising. When mindfulness is there, craving can be interrupted and stopped. It doesn't lead to clinging, doesn't lead to more clinging of these khandhas. It actually leads to more letting go. But when mindfulness is gone, our experience is constantly developing or creating a cause for craving and then clinging to arise. And we keep suffering. So even in the sound of a bell, you can suffer, can't you? I like the bell, I want it, I want to have it, I want to keep it. And they won't let you because you don't own it, and it's someone else's bell, or the bell breaks and then nobody uses it, etc., etc. Your life is like that, isn't it? We're constantly following craving into attachment and ultimately more birth. So the heart of the Buddhist practice is this: it's coming to see closely through our own experience the nature of these 5 khandhas as impermanent, unsatisfactory, because they're constantly changing. They can't bring us constant pleasure as we would like, constant stimulation in the way we would like. The body doesn't stay young and healthy as we would like. feeling is always changing, moving from pleasure to neutral to pain, back to pleasure, back to pain. Perceptions are changing and they trick us and delude us, like the Buddha said, like a mirage. And we forget things, we forget information, we forget people's names, and then we suffer because we forget people's names or other things. Our memory is constantly changing and tricking us, and we're losing it, forgetting things. And the mental formations don't always come up as pleasant and beneficial and wholesome, do they? If we're not on the ball, we get caught into mental proliferation based on greed, on anger, on delusion. So these 5 khandhas are constantly bringing us suffering. They're unsatisfactory in their nature. They're not the real seat of our happiness. And yet we deludedly cling on to them all the time. Doesn't mean to say we should try and destroy these 5 khandhas or get rid of them. What we should try and do is understand them through developing more mindfulness and wisdom, and then use them to our advantage. Because what is it that makes somebody an arahant, brings them to nibbana? It's understanding the 5 khandhas, using them as a basis for developing insight, wisdom. And you can do that if you train yourself through mindfulness to reflect on your 5 khandhas, developing mindfulness and then this ability to look at, observe your experience. Even when you have a painful feeling, it can be a cause for insight, wisdom to arise, letting go of attachment, bringing the mind to a sense of peace. The more you train, even the painful experiences of this body, this mind, bring you wisdom, bring you something useful. Pleasant feelings do that as well, because the more you study the khandhas, you realize any happiness, pleasure based on attachment to these khandhas doesn't last. It can't bring you lasting happiness. Therefore, it's not to be clung to, because what's the point of clinging to something that actually brings you suffering? See, anytime you cling to pleasure, there's suffering hidden in that, because the pleasure doesn't last and you have to experience disappointment, dissatisfaction, the fear of losing it, the anxiety about not getting it back, the search for getting more pleasure is endless. And that's what makes the world go round, isn't it? Human beings always seeking more pleasure, more comfort, and never finding true satisfaction, because they're looking in the wrong place, looking at these khandhas, which are like a red-hot ball of iron. Wherever you attach, even to pleasant experiences, they lead to suffering. This is why our mental formations khandha, the sankhara khandha, is always hard at work, thinking about things, worrying about things, wanting better things, more experience, more pleasure, trying to get rid of the painful, unpleasant experiences, planning, scheming, wanting, never at rest, never at ease, until we start developing the path. Sila, Samadhi, Panya, Magga. This is what starts to bring more benefit. So using the mental khandha of the sankhara khandha to understand the other khandhas and itself is where real peace arises, because we start to see that they're not a real source of happiness. They actually bring us suffering. So the mind wants to let go. If you knew these 5 khandhas were a ball of red-hot iron, you would drop them, wouldn't you? If you pick up something that's really hot, without realizing at first, say something that's hot but it doesn't look hot, and you pick it up, you drop it, don't you? Straight away. That's like the effect of insight. When we train in mindfulness and insight, cut off the craving, the attachment, we're seeing things as they truly are, as hot. And when something is boiling hot, burning hot, you drop it. So somebody practicing this path, as soon as craving arises, they drop it. As soon as attachment arises, they drop it. Attachment to pleasant feeling, they drop. They don't go chasing after it, they drop it. Doesn't mean to say they don't have pleasant feeling, but they don't grasp hold of it because they know it leads to suffering. And sometimes people will say, well, you're only going to understand this by developing meditation, sitting in samadhi for many hours. Well, on the highest level, true, but we're also using our khandhas as we go along through life. because they are our life. Body and mind is here every day. So like say, how do you begin understanding these 5 khandhas and using them to develop the practice? Well, the Buddha said use them for doing good. So use this body to do good things, to develop good things in your life, to help other people, to learn skills, to learn knowledge. You will absorb knowledge through your eyes, your ears. You use your body to go about your business, working, helping your family, helping yourself, doing good things. You use your body for good things. That's using the body khandha, the rupa khandha, for good things. Even though on the ultimate level it's impermanent, not self, you start off from a point of view of having a self. You're still attached to the khandhas with self, so you use them to do good. You can develop pleasant feeling, but also know the limit of it. The limit of the pleasant feeling you can get from this world, from possessions, pleasurable experiences, from love, from friendliness with other people, from having good food, good things, having money, all the things we associate with pleasure to give us pleasure. Be wary of that, because it's a basis for craving and attachment, and it won't bring us permanent, lasting pleasure. But it doesn't mean to say you can't have any pleasure. We need a certain amount of pleasure to be able to function. We need to be able to eat. We need to be able to sleep and rest. We need a certain amount of comfort just to keep going as human beings. Warmth when it's cold, coolness when it's hot, and so on. So feeling in itself is always going to be taking place, but you have to start managing it, learning from it, and seeing the drawbacks of always seeking more pleasure, because it becomes addictive and it's limited. It can't constantly satisfy us, because whatever pleasure we get from sense contact is constantly falling away, dropping away. And that it deludes us, and so we get disappointed when it ends, when it drops away. So you start learning from that in daily life. Just notice how you're constantly looking for the next bit of stimulus, the next nice thing to do, nice experience, pleasant experience, and how much we become a slave to that, seeking pleasure, seeking the happiness of the Vaitana khandha. The Sankhara khandha, is constantly tricking us, because we're constantly falling back into negative thinking, unwholesome thinking that brings with it its own pain, suffering, confusion, delusion. We really have to train that. But that's, not just on the meditation cushion. You go to work, or you go about your business day by day. Your Sankhara khandha, your mental khandha, is working all the time. Mental formations, you have choices to make. So the Buddha said train in developing good karma, thinking skillful thoughts and abandoning unskillful thoughts, putting that into action, skillful speech. That's the khandhas in process on a daily basis, learning to use the khandhas for the practice on every level. Generosity, morality, virtuous behavior, developing states of calm and samadhi, and ultimately developing insight. Every day we look in the mirror to get dressed, look after our face and hair and all that. That's a reflection on the rupa khandha and its changing nature. Who's reflecting? Well, mindfulness and wisdom can be brought to bear on the experience of looking at this body, washing it, cleaning it, looking after it, eating food, bathing it, resting it. You bring the Sankhara khandha up every day to bring up mindfulness, wisdom, wise reflection on your own khandhas. Why we suffer is because half the time we're just sleepwalking through life, following habits of craving and attachment, not realizing how we're building up, kind of unconsciously, silently building up more attachment to the 5 khandhas. Another way the Buddha referred to them is that they're heavy. That's why we're described as piles of experience. Feeling khandha is like feeling upon feeling upon feeling, attached to, identified with, owned. It becomes heavy. Body becomes heavy when you attach to it. You notice when you meditate and start letting go of your attachment to your body, you feel light. It feels good. You get joy, the joy of letting go of attachment arise. Feeling's the same. You can meditate, and even if you're having painful feeling arise in your body, or you have an unpleasant memory arise, when you treat it with mindfulness and insight, the mind can let go of that attachment. The heaviness of the feeling khandha starts to dissipate. So when you meditate, you feel literally lighter and lighter in body and mind, because you're at least temporarily getting some distance between the mind that knows, just consciousness, and then the khandhas, which are always a basis for attachment, clinging to the sense of self. The more we practice, generally the happier, the lighter we feel. But this is happiness based on insight, not just seeking pleasurable experiences, but insight, knowing that even painful experiences are not self, not to be clung to. So gradually we're learning to put down the burden of attaching to the khandhas. So the Buddha says one who's attained Nibbana, they put down the burden. So if you've ever had the privilege of meeting two enlightened people and you wonder, what do they talk about? Well, one of the things I've seen two enlightened monks do is chit-chat about how relieved they are to have put down the burden of attachment. What is the recreation of someone who's reached Nibbana? Is they meet another arahant and it's so good to have put down the burden, isn't it? And they agree and they chuckle and smile because they got no more burdens in life. They're not attached to their khandhas anymore. That's the goal of the practice. They see the khandhas as a burden, as a heavy burden, or as a red-hot ball of iron, and they put it down so they're at ease. No more suffering. We may achieve that occasionally in our meditation, and that's what feeds us to keep practicing, keep doing it, keep looking and examining, keep letting go, keep understanding that true happiness doesn't lie in the body and the mind and the khandhas. It lies in the Dhamma and bringing the mind in line with Dhamma, with truth. So maybe for tonight I've given you some teaching on the five khandhas. I'll leave the talk there, and if there's a chance we can have some questions afterwards.
อันธรรมยังธรรมกัจฉายาสาธุกรังกาตมาเสสาธุสาธุสาธุอนุโมดัน